And joining us now on the debate, 4 Canadians, some Tamil and some Sinhalese, who are involved in efforts to help the situation in Sri Lanka. Ramesh Hettararachi, Natalie Dankotuage, Nathan Shan, and Krishna Saravanamuthu. Hello to you all. Thanks for being here. Before we want to get underway, I just want to say that you are all here, I know, representing yourselves as individuals, not any group, political or otherwise. Okay, so we got that straight. I want to start by going around the table. Ramesh, I'm going to begin with you. What have you been doing to help the situation in Sri Lanka?
We've been, me and a few others have been working together on a project called Build Change, where we try to rediscover the shared interests of Sri Lankan Canadians, whether it be Tamil or Sinhalese, to working together. And the project that we've been working on is to raise $25,000 to build wells in Sri Lanka for war-affected communities. And I'm happy to say that we've actually achieved that goal.
And just to point out, you are of Sinhalese descent.
Yeah, my background's Sinhalese.
Okay.
Yes.
Natalie, what have you been doing in Sri Lanka?
Well, starting in around September 2009, I sort of started working with the Mosaic Institute, and we began planning a series of young Canadian peace dialogues on Sri Lanka. And that's where I met Ramesh, and we were on part of the steering committee to sort of start planning the kind of academics, the kind of civil servants, and activists that we wanted to fly in from Sri Lanka, or from the States, who had an interest in Sri Lanka. We brought them in and invited, youth from across, different ethnic backgrounds with connections to Sri Lanka to come to these dialogues. And we then had smaller sessions where these youth were able to sort of reflect on what we learned and begin to sort of think about what we as Canadians with connections to Sri Lanka could do moving forward in the post-conflict situation that Sri Lanka is in right now. And that, I went from only knowing like 8 members in my steering committee to meeting 100 students through the dialogues, and now I'm a part of Sri Lankans Without Borders, and working with them to continuously do these kind of events and dialogues within the community to really start talking about how can we help Sri Lanka, but in a way that engages across the communities, across the ethnic boundaries that have existed in Toronto throughout the last few years.
Okay, I'm not pointing out ethnic boundaries for any other reason, just to say what your background is. You are also Sinhalese.
Yes.
Okay, Nathan, tell me, what's the work that you've been doing to help the situation?
Well, I've been doing both humanitarian work through various organizations helping. We have All Students Association, Past Students Associations here, regional associations who help to build schools, maintain schools, hospitals and so on, orphanages. And I've also been doing a lot of work on the political side, creating awareness about the need for a political solution, and also human rights, because I don't think these are separated. So human rights work, advocating for a better recognition of the human rights violations that have happened and better way to prevent it.
When you say that, is that focusing only on the Tamil community, or is that focusing on
human rights violations in Sri Lanka?
Okay. Off you go. Tell me, what have you been working on the ground, Krishna?
Well, I became extremely politicized with the Tamil struggle during the 2009 protests, and at that time, the Tamil community was letting the world know that there were grave violations of the Geneva Conventions happening against the Tamils in the northeast of the island of Sri Lanka. There were war crimes and crimes against humanity, and those pleas fell on largely deaf ears. And so what we realized since that time is that it's extremely important that we raise awareness, not just within our own community, not just within the Sinhala community, but with the broader Canadian community as well. And so what we've been doing is we've been working with major civil society organizations like the Canadian Peace Alliance that represents over 1 million people across the country. We've been working with student organizations like the Canadian Federation of Students. We've been working with labor groups like the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. And on top of that, we've been engaging all 3 of the major political federal parties for them to support a call for an international war crimes inquiry into Sri Lanka. And so at that time in 2009, when we were engaged in protests, when we took over the Gardner, for instance, the world didn't know that in a matter of 48 hours, about 30,000 people were killed. But today, 3 years later, our pleas and our calls have been largely vindicated. A UN panel has come out and said that there were in fact war crimes, there were crimes against humanity. Political parties, not just in this country, but all across the world, are now saying that there does need to be accountability for the crimes that happened in 2009, because without justice, you can really have no peace.
But I guess the question is, we're 3 years since the Civil War ended, and there is a collective effort, I would argue amongst 4 of you as well, to move past, if I can put it, that quarter-long century civil war. So are you sort of stuck in the past, or are you moving forward in the work you're doing?
The way I would look at it is a bit more holistically. I would look at what's been happening to the Tamils and also to Sinhalese people over the last 6 decades as a failure of governance in Sri Lanka, as a failure of democratic governance within the island of Sri Lanka. And namely, when I'm talking about the Tamil community, I would talk about the violent persecution, the systemic forms of discrimination that have been imposed through legislation that continue to be imposed against the Tamil people. So this is not an issue of the past, this is very much an issue of today. Otherwise, why is it the case that even though the war is over 100,000 members of the Sri Lankan armed forces continue to militarize the north and east, the traditional Tamil homeland, or as Tamils refer to it as Tamililam?
Okay, Ramesh, I see you kind of shaking your head there.
I mean, it's a lot to answer for in such a short period of time, and I'm not making pretenses. I'm only representing myself here. But quite frankly, I think the stance of talking about war crimes is not really constructive. I think that especially, and I'll be honest with you, I think that the issues pertaining to Sri Lanka of governance needs to be resolved by people in Sri Lanka. And I think that we as a diaspora may be able to influence that conversation. But the diaspora, by and large, is divorced from the reality of living in Sri Lanka. We live in Canada, which is a very different life experience than living in Sri Lanka. And I think that most Sri Lankans are far more aware of the challenges and of the intricacies of living there with the political parties that do exist.
Is that your work that you do on the ground? Is that why you do it? I mean, you help sort of cross boundaries. You're building wells, as you say.
I mean, the work that we do is primarily focused with the Canadian communities. By and large, there's issues of trust that remain. Both communities don't trust each other, and by and large, I think that's still very accurate. We don't really humanize each other. We make ideas out of each other, the Sinhala idea or the Tamil idea, and we're far more than ideas. We're human beings, and we need to be humanized. And we have shared interests, which are not just political, but social, cultural, culinary, food. I mean, we have those shared interests, and the focus on the politics ignores all of those shared identities.
Okay, then let me ask you this, because Ramesh just made an interesting point that I want to see if you guys all agree with. He said we don't trust one another. He talked about two communities, didn't talk about a Sri Lankan community, talked about two communities.
Well, I want to go back to what you said before, because it is a bit of a, I take a little bit of a problem with that, because are we stuck in the past with 3 years ago, if 40,000 people were killed, if justice is not served, if a family member of yours or mine dies, we fight for justice until we just get justice. And we've had war criminals brought to international court after 2 decades, 3 decades, and things are still happening. So to say to a community that has been affected wholly by many thousands of people dying and say you're stuck in the past when you're calling for justice is a bit of a problem. You know, if we say we have to erase all these things, now let me come here, the war is over, I'll give you wells, I'll give you food, I'll give you medicine, now you live with it. It's a kind of a very top-down, oppressive way of looking at reconciliation. I think people need to feel that their calls for justice are answered. And I want to recognize that diaspora has to have a limited role, but until we see journalists, politicians, and people themselves able to express themselves freely in Sri Lanka, which you probably would, as a journalist would agree is not the case, until that happens, we as people who've been forced out of the country, forced to leave, have a voice to give. And that's the role of human rights activists. I don't want to be a person who says, okay, now the war is over, and it's not 25 years. This has been going on for far too long than 25 years. You said 25 years of civil war in armed resistance finished, but this question of independence or question of rights have been going on for a number of years as well. So I think it's important for us to keep this in context, to say, you know, I would like to build wells too, and I can. My family can build one well, and many families can do it too. But that's not going to solve the problem of how people are going to be treated.
Okay, I'm going to go to Natalie, and then I'm going to come to you, Krisha.
I want to say something that, you know, I really believe that personally, I think the past is extremely significant, and whether that be 3 years ago or several years back, into sort of the root causes of why we see these problems in Sri Lanka today. And, you know, when I read, you know, the UN panel report, it said, you know, one of the reasons that we have problems in Sri Lanka is because of exclusionary policies on the basis of ethnicity. And I agree, and I think that, you know, the minority communities in Sri Lanka have experienced a lot of injustices, and those injustices cannot be overlooked at all. And I think that they're significant in order to move forward. However, why it's so important for me to engage across the lines of ethnicity, for me to understand the plight of the Tamil community and try to share with them sort of the plight my parents experienced as well, economically, socially, and politically in that country, that might be deeply connected to sort of the Tamil struggle as well. Because I believe that in order to move forward to create an inclusive Sri Lanka, we need to overcome the fact that these issues are just something that only affects the Tamil community. It affects women in that country. And it affects, lower, women, people of lower, social class in that country. So I think it would be great if, the way that we've been addressing the issues in Sri Lanka, if it could transcend just the issue of ethnicity and go further.
But I guess the question is, and it comes back to what Ramesh said, if there's no trust, how do you move forward? Krishna.
Well, first of all, I think in order to build trust, there does need to be an accountability process for the crimes that have been committed in the past. If we look at, other successful models of reconciliation, like the one we saw post-apartheid South Africa, there was a Truth and Justice Commission. Now, in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, there is a culture of impunity that permeates throughout the country. Amnesty International, for instance, has released a report called 20 Years of Make-Believe, where they have demonstrated that every single commission of inquiry that has been largely put in place due to international pressure over the last 2 decades have been ignored by governments. And that's why there is a need for an international, impartial, credible inquiry to figure out what exactly happened. Why is it that 45,000 to 75,000 people were massacred in a period of 4 months? According to sources on the ground, like the Bishop of Mannar, anywhere between 100,000 to 500,000 people were massacred in cold blood by the Sri Lankan armed
But what about
forces.
starting with something smaller?
If I may ask,
Just let me ask Christian this question. What about starting with something smaller, or 2 tracks at the same time? Isn't that not a legitimate way to move forward?
I absolutely think there needs to be dialogue between the 2 nations within the island of Sri Lanka. And that's why, for instance, we engage with progressive Sinhalese academics like Dr. Judilal Fernando from the University of Dublin, who is now living in exile, because he's spoken out against the crimes that the government has been committing against Tamils, not just the Rajapaksa government, but successive governments. It's important to engage with journalists who are living in exile from the Sinhala community. But we cannot look at when we're looking at an intractable conflict like the one in Sri Lanka, we can't look at the immediate issue around which it seems to be politicized, which in this case is ethnicity. We have to look at the broader structural problems. And if we're going to be frank, the structural problem in Sri Lanka is the unitary structure of Sri Lanka, which centers power in a Sinhalese-dominated legislature, which gives first and foremost place to a religion that is the religion of the majority in that country. And in practice, the Tamil language is not officially implemented as an official language. So let's address those structural problems. Let's ensure that the Tamils do have the right to self-determination in the northeast of the island of Sri Lanka, and there is then no need why Tamils and Sinhalese cannot live together and coexist together and even share power with one another on a nation-to-nation basis.
Ramesh, how often do you talk to people about Sri Lanka that you disagree with and have those kinds of conversations?
Well, it's just really interesting to hear this, because for me, I lived in Sri Lanka for 3 years. I did my schooling in Sri Lanka. And quite frankly, I think what's happening here is that we have different experiences in living, right? And I think that, again, the diaspora is disconnected from the realities of Sri Lanka. In terms of disagreements, I mean, I talk fairly regularly with people on the ground, both Tamil and Sinhalese, who have a very different idea of what politics should be like. And they have and don't get me wrong, I'm not a complete support of the Sri Lankan government. But having said that, there's a wide recognition in Sri Lanka that change is going to come slowly. To give you an example that more Canadians could be identified with, at the end of World War I, Germany, the Allies won, and they implemented the Treaty of Versailles, and so-called reparations, right, as a sort of a way to reconcile.
Sure.
20 years later, we had World War II. World War II, what was really interesting was they actually had the Marshall Plan. The United States had the Marshall Plan, which was talking about rebuilding infrastructure. And now you have Germany, who's now the dominant country in Europe.
Okay.
And I completely agree with what you said earlier. To start off with small things. And there are all these larger political issues that there is a time and a place. And I also do not think we should forget about the past. But it's like trying to forget about the past, trying to say forget about your grandmother. It doesn't happen, right? But having said that, there is a time and a place. And accountability doesn't take years. Sometimes it takes decades. And the current segments of the diaspora don't recognize that. That change takes time, and political change takes time. And yeah.
Okay, Natalie, go ahead.
Well, just to really address sort of what Krishna just said about, I think that, when we put all the blame on the political state, like on the structure of the state, and not recognize sort of the grassroots causes for why these kind of politicians exist. And, if Sri Lanka is this, Sinhala majoritarian Buddhist state, why does that exist? And these politicians are being elected by people on the ground. So I really believe that in order to transform the kind of state that we're seeing right now in this unitarian government that doesn't really represent, people that are, the excluded middle, that don't fit into these specific ethnic identities, well, we have to really look at why do people see their community and understand their communities within, finite, ethnic boundaries. And for me, like, the dream for Sri Lanka is to get kids to think outside of just seeing themselves as Sinhalese, and that comes from personally being, Canadian and constantly having to, negotiate in spaces that my ethnicity can't be the first thing I think of. And when I go in to make a vote for my politician, I don't think about, does he represent me ethnically? Because he doesn't. And so I have to look further and deeper into what are the values that I want to see in my politician. And I think moving forward, if we want to see Sri Lanka change structurally, we have to work from the grassroots and try to inspire and enlighten people to think outside of just thinking ethno-nationally.
I think the question about trust, I trust a lot of Sinhalese. I've worked with a lot of Sinhalese population. It's not, I don't have a problem with Sinhalese as a population. But what happens is that who needs to trust who? The Sri Lankan communities from various places and the Tamil community needs to trust the government. If the government was to represent them, they need to trust the government. And there's no way in the past record or even currently anything has been proposed or anything has been done to build trust from that sense of it. I don't have a problem with people working together to plant trees, read literature together. I love literature written by Sinhalese authors as well as Tamil authors. I can play cricket with Sinhalese people without any problem. But if I start showing off that as a simplistic way of resolving this massive oppressive framework of governance in Sri Lanka, that actually does a lot of damage because people start to simplify the situation. Just like French Canadians and English Canadians, we can live together. A lot of people are married together. But the question about rights of the French population still remains a higher level discussion. If you don't have that discussion, it doesn't mean somebody is married to somebody or somebody lives with somebody, somebody gets you trusted with somebody. It does not mean that is a way to resolve the issue. The trust is not the issue. Tamil people, after having gone through a lot of things, still feel very connected with the Sinhalese population. And whether it's the same country or a neighboring country, we still connect. I don't have a problem with that. We have many ways to demonstrate that. But the only thing is when we have issues that are like five young people from the Sinhalese community, Tamil community can go and do tree planting, read books, but that gets into the media and people start to see, here, people affected are getting together and resolving. Why can't you do this in Sri Lanka? That's the diaspora disconnect. If you're saying diaspora is disconnected when they're advocating for human rights, the same diaspora is also disconnected when you have 5 and 5 people just tree planting and reading literature and showing to people who are affected, we can get along. Why can't you?
So should they not do that?
No, they can do that, but why do you extrapolate that to a political message?
But
why is it that being humanitarian work, do it. Do it all you want. Why do you have to do a tree planting and have it in all the media to show that this is how we reconcile? Because that is the problem. Because if you're doing good work, there are a lot of people doing massive amount of good humanitarian work not coming on the media. When 5 and 5 people get together to plant trees and all this stuff, this is the way to discredit anybody advocating for human rights, saying, we are doing this wonderful, I love this person, I can get along with this person, why can't you? It's very discrediting.
But we're not saying that we're reconciling. And I don't know what could be trying to mention for that, but just because you get together and work, it doesn't mean we agree politically. It means you're starting to build trust, that is the most important thing that we as Canadians can show. Because quite frankly, to say that we cannot work together because we disagree politically, I think it's a farce. We can disagree politically, but have so many other areas of common ground. I'm not saying that just because we disagree politically, we don't work together. And quite frank, and to say that just, for me, the key issue right now is how do we actually work together? And I don't think that anything that the diaspora can do long term is going to fundamentally influence the country politically. It has to be done in the country. That's democracy for you. And to talk about two states or separate states, Quebec is not a nation. And Quebec is not a separate country. You mentioned French. It's not a country, right? And we cannot lose sight of the fact that even though we disagree, we may look different, we may talk different, it doesn't mean we have to separate and be different countries. And I keep in mind, I will also say that I think there are fundamental issues that to be addressed within Sri Lanka, specifically the reconciliation. And I do agree with Krishna that the militarization of the North and Northeast is a problem. But I don't know how we here in the diaspora can tell a country what to do with it internally.
And also just to address the idea of that, when I started getting more involved in the community, there was a lot of things happening in the community that would get youth together across ethnic boundaries, to go to dinner dances or go to the bar and to be social. But it would undermine and not truly address sort of the trauma that existed in our communities or the political division that existed. And for me, when I did start to get involved in the community, it was very important for me to get involved in organizations that were going to talk about these injustices and the prejudices that exist within us. But I realized that personally, for me to make a transformative change, I have to address my own prejudices first. Before I point my finger at the government, before I point my finger at political parties, I need to talk about what exists with my family. And a lot of it happened. Started dialoguing with my parents, having really harsh and strong, sentimental conversations about the prejudices that did exist in our communities. And when I see what the youth here in the Tamil diaspora are doing, and how much they care about their communities back home, I understand how they feel, because you have a connection from your heart to that island. And as much as we've grown up here or we've moved here, we have two homes, and that can never be overlooked. And there's a transnational connection that Tamil youth have. My only thing is that as someone who's Sinhalese, but feels a connection to them and wants to work in allegiance with them, but can't support something that's violent, because that might come at the expense of my family there and things like that. So I want to say that I do tree planting, but I do so because I want to purge the prejudices by engaging with the community.
Krishna, let me ask you, she just brought up something. You need to take a little time to just look in the mirror and reflect and think about what your responsibility is and so forth. Is that a fair position to take at the beginning?
Well, I think the real question here and the real issue that I take is with the insinuation that the diaspora is somehow disconnected to the ground realities. I want to point out a fact.
Have you been to Sri Lanka?
I've never been to Sri Lanka.
Okay, but isn't that a disconnect?
Actually, absolutely not. Let me point out a few numbers here. There were at one point 3 million people living in the Northeast, 3 million Tamils. 800,000 of them have become refugees, either internally displaced people or people who have fled to other countries all around the world and who became the global Tamil diaspora. These people are very much connected, the first generation of people who came to this part of the world and the second generation of people, because these are our kith, these are our kin, this is our ancestral homeland. Please let me finish. To somehow insinuate the diaspora is disconnected is intellectually dishonest. Second of all, there is an insinuation that people who strongly stand for the Tamil right to self-determination, let me remind you that self-determination is a human right that's enshrined in the UN Convention on Political and Civil Rights, the UN Convention on Social and Economic Rights, somehow that these people are disconnected from Sinhalese. That's not the case. But we do have to look at the structural imbalances, and if we agree that there are these structural imbalances, we have to look at the terms on which communities come together. One community is the oppressed community. One community, according to Sinhalese academics with conscience, like Dr. Judlal Fernando, or Sinhala journalists like Rohit Bashna, or Vijay Mendes, or international legal professors like Dr. Francis Boyle, these individuals have said that what's happening against the Tamil people—
Those are all Sinhalese that agree with you, and I'm curious how often you talk to Sinhalese people that don't agree with your point of view.
In fact, most of the Sinhala allies that I have who agree with me also disagree with me on a lot of issues. So again, there's an insinuation here that Tamils who believe in the right to self-determination, which is an international human right, cannot get along with Sinhalese people. Please let me finish.
But let's talk about that.
So let me finish. Let me finish.
Let him finish, then I'll
The
continue.
point I was trying to make is all these international legal scholars, these academics from the Sinhala community, these exiled Sinhalese journalists, and even the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights have indicated that there's a genocide happening against the Tamil people. So there's a real power imbalance. And if we're going to recognize this power imbalance, let's not make reconciliation, or let's resist attempts in reconciliation to sweep under the rug the real structural problems. Let's address those structural problems. Let's address the fact that there is an inequity of power between these two communities. That's the only way to really bring communities together and to promote true reconciliation.
Okay, Ramesh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the argument that there's a genocide, I think, can be disputed based on facts. But I'm not going to get into that. What I think, let's talk about the disconnect part. You haven't lived in Sri Lanka, and you're talking about a country. Most people in diaspora, when they look back, they see the island as unchanging, as static. The country's always changing. Let's take language, for instance. If you look at Quebec and France, when Quebec is seen, a lot of Quebecers, from what I'm told, see their French as being the more authentic French because they go back to the old style of French. But the French language in Paris is very, very different. Similarly speaking, when in Sri Lanka, the country is changing. It's changing very slowly, but it is changing. And that's a very important fact. Just because if you haven't been to the country and if you haven't talked to people in the country, you need to have a broader experience. My second point is about the whole self-determination part. Quite frankly, it's a concept that I would love to believe in, but I'm more cared about the more immediate short-term needs of the people on the ground. There are people without water. There are people without education, and there are people without the ability to go fend for themselves. And if you want to go and talk about self-determination and a nation state and Tamil Eelam, that's fine, go for it. 30 years, go for it. But there are people who need desperate help on the ground. And for me and my work with respect to Sri Lanka, I prefer to focus my work on the short-term needs.
Can I say something?
You can go ahead.
Okay, so I have worked on a lot of short-term needs. My problem is that short-term needs that are being done within for example, a name called Sri Lankans Without Borders for a humanitarian effort of a divided country itself is an imposing of a particular identity. People who do not still identify as Sri Lankan, if you want to bring them in, you don't name it something like that. You don't have $25,000. Our village associations raises $100,000 each, sending a lot of money. When you do that and then come across and say short-term needs are not being met, that is a big. The Tamil community here have been raising money. You covered tsunami. You know how much money Tamil community raised from here. The money is not the issue. Our community has worked hard in Canada, has built a lot of social and economic capacity. We can take care of that. But we don't want our people to be oppressed. I think the diaspora is disconnected. If I take that argument, I want the people in Sri Lanka, Tamils and Sinhalese, to have a say. If the Tamils can have a free referendum without one army officer for 4 Tamils having a gun, you get an international country to play a role and have a referendum, ask the Tamil people. Don't tell me when you have militarized, when you have attacked all media, when you have attacked most of the journalists and politicians, that the people are free to say, and you go and ask them, they'll be happy with food and shelter because that's what they've been forced into. But at the same time, you can't tell me I don't have a right to say, because I have lost, at the age of 16, I was forced to leave my country, leave my relationship, leave my social capital to come to this country, forced to migrate. That happened. And now I don't have a say in what happens there?
I see that you have a difference of opinion, but do you accept that they have the right to be doing the kind of work that they want to be doing?
I applaud the work they do, but what I'm questioning is the way in which this is forcing a kind of a unitary solution and forcing a reconciliation on top of a community that's been...
Just to be clear, we're not forcing anything. Why do you... Just an open-ended question. Why do you say we're forcing? Because I don't understand what you're saying.
I think you can try to see what Mosaic Institute has put out. Okay. You can try to see what Sri Lankans Without Borders are saying.
What have they put out?
No, what they're saying is that we are all Sri Lankans.
No, we're not. No, we've not said that. Okay.
So the real question is, do you agree with the Tamil right to self-determination?
I guess what I have to say...
That's the real question here.
But here's the thing. We don't take... See, this is what I guess... We're talking on 2 separate conversations, right? Mosaic, to my understanding, Mosaic Institute doesn't take a position on Sri Lanka.
It has.
Okay, we don't want to talk about Mosaic.
But my point is that we're not taking a position in Sri Lanka. We're saying, look, and I quite frankly agree with you, the Tamil community has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's fine. The difference with Bill Change, and which I'm frankly quite proud of, is said, look, we may disagree on political stuff, but let's see if we can work together and find shared interests. And the that shared interests element is very unique to any other initiative out there.
Can I ask you then?
Let me just get Natalie in here.
I guess I just want to say that, and nowhere in Sri Lankans Without Borders or the Mosaic Institute are we talking about the unitary state. It's just about engaging across the communities to really sort of come to a consensus. We're still figuring it out, what we'd like to see. When it comes to Tamil determination, the problem, I think, the limitations of the diaspora sometimes is that when we come here, it's really easy for us to just engage within our exclusive communities. Growing up, I went to exclusively Sinhalese community events. And I think a lot of youth in the Tamil community probably experienced something similar, where they didn't cross-engage ethnically. Now, when you go back to Sri Lanka, the situation is a lot different, in the sense that when you go to places like Colombo, like my dad is from Kotena, and I remember when he lives in a very small little, he's from a small little, area, where Tamil and Sinhala people live like they're neighbors, and these kids are going to school, constantly interacting with one another. I'm not going to say that I haven't seen problems there in their interactions, and I haven't seen, sometimes prejudice exist. I've seen that, but they're living really close together now. And further, when you go to places like the North, when I was traveling in the North this summer, and I think that's the responsibility for diaspora, is to go to Sri Lanka, because you have to go see the reality on the ground. When I was traveling around the North with the Veeramantri Center, and we were doing some legal aid camps in the North, and when I was in Ampara, realizing, I was, working with some young girls, and they were Sinhalese, and they were from a little town called Mangalagama, which is a small little village in the North, and they were under the war throughout the last 30 years. Now, how is Tamil determination going to deal with the reality of that? And how are we going to accept that, Tamil ethno-nationalism, and I no way support single ethno-nationalism, and I'd love to see single ethno-nationalism grow and become something that represents something more pluralistic. But how is Tamil ethno-nationalism going to address the issue of that has led to things like the expulsion of, Muslims during the 1990s? Ethno-nationalism has a lot of consequences. It's very exclusive. It does not create inclusive understanding of citizenry, and that's a huge problem that that needs to be considered and understood, because there are people and lives who are living in that country that want to feel accepted, regardless if it's under a Tamil state or a Sinhala state, which I think both do not represent the plural identities that exist in Sri Lanka.
Krishna.
When we're talking about self-determination, I want to remind people that we're not talking about ethno-nationalism. Perhaps ethno-nationalism is a byproduct of the failure to accommodate the peaceful demand to self-determination. Now, if we look at this country as an example, there is a very strong Quebec national identity. In the 1970s, we saw something like the FLQ crisis. When was the last time we saw an FLQ crisis in this country? Because guess what? In this country, our federal government decided to politically and legally accommodate the Quebec people's right to self-determination. That's why we see an asymmetric form of government. That's why we see Quebec having control over its own immigration policies, over its own cultural policies. And that's why there is no FLQ crisis today. I'm not suggesting that the Quebec issue is resolved. What I am suggesting, though, is that there is the possibility, very real political and legal structures can exist to accommodate the demand for self-determination. Let's look at another example, Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is an example where the British government was working behind the scenes to arrange a political settlement. And what we saw eventually happen when the political process opened itself up was even Gerry Adams, the head of Sinn Féin, who was demonized by the British press, saying, you know what, the IRA, we're calling upon you to lay down your arms, let's have a peaceful political process here. So again, I want to remind you that self-determination is a human right. If this human right is accommodated, there is no need why the Tamils and the Sinhalese cannot meet on an equal nation-to-nation basis, perhaps Tamil in Sri Lanka. Let's reimagine the possibilities. Why is it that when we talk about reconciliation, that we can't have a real, credible, honest conversation about the merits of a two-state solution? Why can't we have that conversation? You know why? Because in Sri Lanka, it's constitutionally illegal to talk about Tamil sovereignty.
And we have about 5 minutes left, and that actually is a good segue into what I want to talk about this last 5 minutes. I mean, we've talked about how this discussion wouldn't happen in Sri Lanka. We can have it here in Canada. It's a peaceful place where we can have open dialogue. And I'm wondering, is there, though, a missed opportunity here in Canada from within the diaspora to have a constructive dialogue that actually helps out in Sri Lanka? Nathan?
I want to have a conversation with them if they're able to say, let's talk about both a single state as well as two-state solution. Let's not call ourselves Sri Lankan without borders. Let's call us something where we're not being imposter identity. If I want to join Sri Lankans without border, I am a Sri Lankan by default. So what I'm saying is,
But are you talking about a change in semantics?
No, it's the concept of
change in ideology.
Because
Just hold on,
let me
Ramesh.
finish, let me finish.
finish.
There's you saw last few years. There's a large number of young people who are involved in the Tamils struggle. And they are left out in this conversation because they're seen as not accommodating this unitary solution. And all these things, the reconciliation efforts are taking place. If I want to talk about gender oppression, class oppression with the Sinhalese population, I want to talk about what socioeconomic impact. I'm an advocate for social and economic impact. I want to talk about those core issues and work with those communities to make sure the Sri Lankan population and Tamil population, which I see as connected in many struggles, need to work together on that. If I see something that's coming to me top down saying, this is a reconciliation, we're going to build you this, we're going to do this for you, that's very insulting to the Tamil community's capacity. Our struggle is about political and human rights. Our struggle is not about wealth and food and rice and potatoes. Our struggle needs to be recognized where it is. And I can work with, if the Sinhalese population has been facing economic hardship, I agree, because of a brutal government which prioritizes war machinery more than economic prosperity. I would sit down with them. I would actually work on projects together to address those issues, because those are the issues that we need to work on, not impose an identity on me until I have bought into that identity.
We don't, and I'm not going to speak about specific organizations, but nobody's imposing identity. And quite frankly, the failure to engage is not Canadian. I'm being very frank with you. Okay? It is contrary to the ideals of Canada. We as Canadians should have at least one foundational principle, is to engage. We may disagree, and quite frankly, Sri Lanka without borders, I can tell you right now, there are people who support separatism, straight up. Okay? But they at the very least have the decency and the integrity to engage. Okay? The second thing is about separatism. You talked about missed opportunity. In Sudan, I think South Sudan, I think they had a referendum. Last year, I think. And again, it's sliding back into war. A referendum doesn't mean anything. We need to talk about concrete ways to actually work together and engage with each other. And even in the episode of Sinn Féin Northern Ireland, nobody was imposing anything. Nobody was having a round table saying, you know what, let's talk about Northern Ireland. There was actual concrete ways in which people said, on the ground, said, look, enough of the violence, let's work together.
And let's peacefully accommodate the Northern Islanders' demands for political independence.
That's what the diaspora can do. And if it just talks about humanitarianism, it doesn't work. Coming back to the point, it is a huge missed opportunity.
We have about a minute left.
I just want to say that growing up here in Canada, growing up as a minority, has really made me sort of fight for minority rights, regardless if that minority identity is ethnically or class-based or gender-based understanding of that minority identity. And the reality is, when I look at Sri Lanka, I feel connection to the minority communities. But the thing is, minorities exist not only in the north, they exist in the south as well. And so, when you talk about self-determination, that's great. I don't really know how I feel about whether I want a separate state or a united state. But I'm saying, okay, if you're going to do something for Sri Lanka, what are you going to do for the Tamil youth in the south, living, amongst Sinhalese communities there? Is there no resolution for them? Is it just, you can live under single ethno-nationalism, that's fine. And we'll go create Tamil ethno-nationalism in the north, and or you can move here. People have connections and roots to Colombo and parts of the south as well. And the thing is, if there's gonna be resolution, we need to have a resolution for minorities across the country. And I don't think that what's been happening right now has been addressing the issues minorities face across the
It is clear to me one thing from this conversation, that there's a lot more talking that's going to happen. I thank you all for coming in and having this most interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ramesh Hettiarachchi, next to him Natalie Dankotuage, and on the other side of the table, Nithan Shan and Krishna Saravanamuthu. Thank you all.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.